Hello. So, I just disappeared for over 6 months without saying anything. Oh man, things have gotten tough since last I was on the tube.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
No more orcs as monsters. That's crazy, right? Regardless, I'll still be throwing hordes of green-skinned pigmen at my players whenever I can. And on top of that, I think the timing couldn't be any better. I've almost finished my ebook on orcs and goblins, which I'll release here for free, but that's for another video. So, yeah. I don't have a good story as to why I was away for so long. I got sidetracked with a few other projects here and there, and I decided I was going to put my account on ice for a while. I feel the problem was I didn't have a solid game plan, just a bunch of ideas, and pressure to try and pump out a video each week. This stressed me out a little, even though I don't have a big audience with expectations. But I'm back, with a game plan this time, I promise. But before we get into the swing of things, here is the much anticipated Gnome video I had planned to release last year. I didn't re-record my voice as the video was 95% ready to go. I did, however, record this part and the end. So without further ado, let's go back in time. Hello, it's been a while, 3 weeks actually, since I've done a video. I've been really busy getting my friend Camilla's music video together, as well as working on other creative projects, including my novel, which I've been writing for many years now actually, and it's slowly coming together, but that's for another video. Today I want to talk about gnomes. Pointy Hat did a video a few weeks ago discussing his frustrations with gnomes. At the end of his insightful critique, he created a stat block for a puck subclass, and this inspired me to want to discuss my own homebrew world's gnomes. Whilst not groundbreaking, I do enjoy leaning into the gnome stereotypes as opposed to veering from their aesthetics. So less of this and more of this. My inspiration for my homebrew setting comes from various places. However, the strongest influence on my developing geek brain as a child was less of this man and more of these two men. Oddly enough, throughout most of my teens, 20s and into my early 30s, I had rarely played a D&D game. I could count how many on one hand. I mostly played material from Peter and Ian, including the Fighting Fantasy game books, Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, and homebrewing my own systems. So I guess you could say I was D&D adjacent in those early days. It wasn't until much later that I started to delve deeper into D&D and Pathfinder. My first perception on gnomes came from Out of the Pit, not Out of the Abyss, which stated,
"Gnomes shun the affairs of other creatures. They are small humanoids related distantly to dwarves, and may be encountered in remote areas. They prefer to be left alone, free from the attentions of other races, who seem only to bring violence and other complications to their simple lives."
This kind of made sense, since both races are short, bearded, grumpy SOBs. So from then on, I saw gnomes as a dwarven variant, unlike the more elven halfling-like gnomes of D&D. In my fantasy setting, gnomes were dwarves who left their underground mansions for the forests of the world, to learn magic from the elves and the fae, as magic is generally frowned upon by dwarves, which made those who practiced exiles. In time, they gradually shrunk in size, but maintained the dwarven tradition of the beards. Using their mechanist minds and newly acquired magical knowledge, they began to tinker and hone their crafting abilities to new heights, which surpassed the dwarves. They also learned how to graft and blend the living materials of the forests into their constructions. Thus was born the gnomes' fungal technologies, which were inspired by the race's new subterranean realm below the woodlands of the Fae. D&D has forest, rock and deep gnomes, and my homebrew setting of Eratra has iron gnomes or cogwork gnomes. gnomes and forest gnomes or woodwork gnomes. Both use magic and machinery, but look at the world in a different way. The iron gnomes champion the use of earth metals, much like their dwarven ancestors. They believe in fusing magic with metal to create reliable inventions essential for their society's efficiency, whereas forest gnomes prefer hybrid technology combining plants, fungi, wood and metal. They believe in maintaining the natural balance and preventing pollution from mining and refining metals. I have 2 supplemental documents linked in the description below, which you can mine for ideas or outright use. The first is a PDF giving a brief history and lore of the gnomes and their cousins the leprechauns, and some equipment and weapons which you can use, including the mushroom cap, mushroom shield, oak warhammer, mushroom boots, the fairy ring gate, mushroom mechs and an airship. The second PDF is a whole rule system for a game called Shroom Jump. This actually absorbed 90% of my time piecing this material together. Basically, the game takes place in the gnome capital city of Abnathaxel, in this great earthen shaft which connects the depths of the city to the surface world. A crop of what I call air shrooms are severed at their stalks, causing them to float up the shaft to the surface and the sky beyond. Players must compete with the gnomes to jump from shroom to shroom to get to the surface, fighting each other in non-lethal combat. If you are knocked off a shroom, you will plummet into the underground water stream below and be caught up by gnome mages who will drag you to the shore. So this next part of the video will be explaining a summarized version of the rules with some visuals. Movement. Movement is done using a VTT of your choice. I have created 4 battle maps for the various parts of the earthen shaft. I prefer a hex map with 5 feet hexes, as it makes it easier to use the air shroom tokens and is best suited for a circle style map. Each battle map you'll be creating 3 levels, but resizing the tokens to create an illusion of depth. When players or monsters are on level 3, the highest level, of a map, they will appear on level 1 on the next connecting battle map. The vertical distance between these levels should range somewhere between 10 to 15 feet. I put the level height in the top left hand corner to keep track. Each level will have an amount of air shrooms spread out for the players to use as platforms to jump horizontally and vertically on. Now let's go through the pages briefly. Jumping. Pages 3 to 5 detail the jumping mechanics of the game. Taking the basics of jumping from 5e, I gave players additional distance in both long and high jumps due to the elasticity of the air shrooms, propelling them into the air. I did, however, retain the 10 feet run-up requirement for each jump. Additionally, I created 2 more jump types. A rule for trampoline jumps, which is the feet a player drops from one air shroom to another, times 2, and adding their strength modifier to determine the bounce back height. And diagonal jumps, which took me much longer to figure out. This is because of me stumbling on the Pythagoras theorem when calculating the horizontal distance to an object, i.e. a player to an air shroom, and comparing it to its diagonal position, elevated above the same spot, the diagonal distance being further away even if the object is simply moved vertically above its original spot. I found the average additional feet in the diagonal distance and rounded it to 5, then made the rule have the player deduct this from their horizontal jumping potential. Therefore, for simplicity, diagonal distance to air shrooms could be measured in the VTT as the same distance as if it was horizontally on the same plane, without having to have decimal distances. For example, an air shroom that is horizontally 20 feet away is the same distance as an air shroom horizontally 20 feet and 10 feet vertically away from the jumper, even though technically it isn't. But the 5 feet penalty to the jumper will compensate for the difference, if that makes sense. It took me forever to come up with that. I guess technically you could add that 5 feet penalty to the distance if you wanted to, but I found deducting as a penalty was less confusing when using measuring tools on a VTT. Another rule I created that consumed a lot of my time was the movement debt rule. This was to compensate for jumps that exhausted a PC's movement, even though they could take the leap, which would leave them either suspended halfway through their jump and ending their turn, or something else. I decided that this debt can only total their total movement speed. So if a PC moves at 30 feet, they can only be in debt by 30 feet. For example, I also came up with a rule for vertical jumps that don't succeed for the PC, allowing them to grab onto the hanging stalk of an airshroom. Also, I made a fraction rule which allowed PCs to round up their movement after a jump. Combat. Pages 7 to 10 covers combat, from shroom padding to dampen attacks to non-lethal damage. The 5e shove action is also included so combatants can push each other off airshrooms in their ascent. There are some knockback rules for melee combat, which I sourced from D&D Wiki. And finally, some rules to incorporate the airshrooms into attacks, that is, ramming and bouncing an airshroom against another airshroom, a la bumper cars. Interaction. Pages 11 to 13 covers interacting with the airshrooms themselves. I give the floating fungus an AC of 10 with 15 HP. Damage against them can be something as little as being stationary to leaping off or landing on them. We have a few situations there for you to consider. You will also find information on the elemental air boots, not to be confused with the mushroom boots, which rely on elemental air canisters. I actually created both types of boots at the same time, and settled on the game using the elemental ones, as you can litter the map with canisters for refueling. There's also rules for grabbing the airshrooms when falling, rules for standing on upside down airshrooms, a random environmental shift table, which you can use every round or two to make the game more dynamic and challenging. If you don't want to plan out the random airshrooms per the 3 levels, you can use the random airshroom placement chart. And 2 optional rules I've tacked onto the bottom, which include the ledge rule, if you want to allow players to use the rocky ledges around the shaft, and the dragon chase rule, where gnome spellcasters conjure an illusion of a dragon which chases the jumpers up the shaft to the surface. If you are too slow during the ascent and overtaken by the illusion, you lose the game. Finally, I have a couple of Gnome Jumper 5e monster stats at the end as well. Okay guys, that's the last video of 2024, which has finally been released in 2025. I was going to record a demo playthrough, but I'll do that in a separate video. So please like, comment and subscribe and all the usual, and until then...